Karthik, thank you not just for being here, but also being here for the post-lunch session. I think for the organizers, it's brilliant to have you here. I was already telling Karthik that we are not doing formal introductions, not that Karthik needs one, but I just have to ask him about ASER. And then at the end, I'll remind him, time is up, let's take 2 audience questions. So I really just I just get to sit close to Karthik to hear about all the things that we want to hear from him about education, about state capacity, about outcome measurement, and of course, all the core ideas that we know you've put extensive hours, effort, and energies in putting into your book. Thank you for that. To begin with, and because we're in a room talking about education, let's talk about ASER 2024 results. Incredible results, what Dr. Wilma herself calls as more than just a COVID recovery. I think it has the entire ecosystem of education excited, not just from a learning outcome perspective, but smartphone penetration seeing 10 percentage point improvement. And because you missed the first half of the day today where all of us, I think, spoke about NIPUN multiple times. And things like attendance as a metric going up and teaching learning material availability showing significant improvement has all of us excited. Would love to hear your perspective, both as an economist, as a researcher, and especially from an outcome perspective on ASER 24, Karthik.
I'll keep it quick. So first of all, thank you. Thanks for the invitation. It's always a pleasure to be among kindred spirits working in this space. And I think I keep saying one of the tragedies of kind of the academic life is I often have to shut myself out of kind of human contact to do deep writing, but it's lovely to emerge and kind of, just engage with people in the real world doing stuff. So clearly the ASER, I see the ASER results as green shoots, right? I think, so the good news is certainly we have a lot to be kind of optimistic about because there's been this big push in FLN, big push in NIPUN, certain alignment from the NEP to the policy, to the partners on the ground, working with state governments. Because see, like Vijay, who's the CEO of CGIS, likes to say, ideas in government can get killed at 15 different levels, right? So it's not enough just to get a minister on board or a secretary on board or a commissioner on board or a collector on board. Because with 5 levels on board, you can still, not translate that because there are going to be other constraints in the field, okay? So I think the challenge with these kind of systems change initiatives in the social sector and why, after working in education for 20 years, why I have pivoted more of my attention to state capacity is because I think there are enough now high-quality organizations working on education, but the cross-cutting governance challenges are kind of the much more wicked ones, right? So I think it reflects how hard it is to move system-level outcomes at scale. And we managed to do mission mode things like vaccination campaigns, but this requires ongoing, day after day after day of kind of consistent effort. And so I think in that sense, the results are certainly, very encouraging. But like I keep saying, our grade is a solid B+ in that it's well done, but there's still so much more to do. And I think, if anything, I still kind of, focus more on how far we have to go, right? And so even if you look at even if you assume that the trend from 2022, which is post-COVID, to 24 is in fact the trend, that is still about 3.5 percentage points a year, right? At max in terms of these reading levels. And we're talking about another 25 years to get to 100%. And if you add how many kids that'll be another 200 million kids, who are graduating without being able to read, okay? So it's kind of imperative to really bring that and compress that cycle so that we're hitting FLN by 2030, 2034 at the latest. And that means there's still an enormous amount of work to do, okay? So I think, my high-level summary is well done, keep at it.
No, I think very well put. And I think that is the mood in every room where ASER is being discussed. Well done, but abhi Delhi dur hai. We have to be at it collectively. I think you also referred to, when you look at it from the perspective of not just how far we've come, but how far we need to reach. And I think let's take a moment to realize that the current rate of improvement that ASER shows still puts us almost close to 3 decades away from where we can say at a national level all our kids are NIPUN. I think a lot of what will be required from a state capacity perspective is, Karthik, what you've put down in your book. I almost thought I should carry the book along, just a physical copy, though I'm sure mostly everyone in this room is familiar with. I want to get the title right. Accelerating India's Development, State-Led Roadmap for Effective Governance. And Karthik, what I wanted to ask you was that in context of NIPUN Bharat, and specifically that book, and of course the book is across sectors, but education has been close to your heart as since your student days and your research days, but specifically to get scale and sustainable results for FLN, which is also of interest to the FLN, the LiftEd ecosystem of partners here. How do you think in terms of data, measurement, and the personnel? Because at the end of the day, it's capacity within the government system that has to do that. And I'll break the question into two parts. One, just fundamentally, how do you see these levers will be required for sustainable learning gains at scale? And second, specifically from the lens of outcome-based financing, which has been a big theme that we covered in the first part of the day today.
So let me actually take that question in reverse order, right? And I think the reason I want to do it in reverse order is changing the entire system is sometimes more complex than even anybody in this room can do. But outcome-based financing is something, like that is core to what LiftEd is trying to do. So let me flip that around, okay? And so the first thing is, so let me just first say I'm a huge fan, okay? I'm a huge fan of the idea of outcome-based financing, okay? And the core principle of effective organizations, okay? If you think about any private sector company, in any effective organization, a core principle is that you provide autonomy to the person on the ground, okay? Who's close to the problem on process, okay? But you have accountability for outcomes, okay? So in any well-run organization, the frontline person is told, okay, you know the problem, you have the resource envelope, we empower you to figure out how to solve this, but there is going to be some kind of skin in the game with regard to outcomes because we're going to monitor outcomes and that's what's going to determine your pay, your promotions, your bonuses and all of that, right? Whereas in government, we do exactly the opposite, right? Which is you micromanage on process so that the frontline staff has very little autonomy, very little discretionary budget, and frankly, very few levers, right? So if you're even a motivated block education officer, you don't have, like sometimes I've tried to do enough work on public sector management to literally get to this point that the only tool that a mid-level manager in the government has is yelling, okay? So you shout at people and people do things so that they don't get shouted at, okay? Because you can't do the increments, you can't do the postings, so you have no levers, right? Of effective management, okay? So, and that's because, and like Yamini and Shayana showed in their paper, these mid-level officials often perceive themselves as powerless cogs who are kind of post offices, right? Transmitting orders from the top and data from down without kind of exercising agency with regard to how they're going to improve the system, okay? So I think the structural shift we need is basically saying you want autonomy on process and accountability for outcomes, okay? And this is, again, I'll take a slight 1-minute detour, but this is, I think, something that we have a lot to learn from China, okay? So sitting in India, we often learn the wrong lessons from China, okay? We think about China as being successful because it's the strong centralized government, okay? But in practice, China is one of the most decentralized countries in the world with over 50% of spending happening at the local government level. In India, that number is 3%, excluding Maharashtra, okay? So, which means it's so top down that you don't have kind of skin in the game on the front line. Now, why am I giving you this background? It's because to me, what outcome-based financing does is it provides a mechanism to start reorienting how the system functions, right? Because, and this is not just true within government, this is true in the space of nonprofits who are working on education. And your typical donor will come and try to micro-specify what the partner is doing based on their theory of change, okay? Whereas what you want is exactly the opposite, saying as a donor, as a funder, I care about outcomes, but you are the org that's close to the ground and I'm going to trust you to figure out how to deliver this, but I'm going to put some skin in the game, okay? That's based on outcomes. So that's why I'm a huge fan overall, of what this does for the ecosystem of moving the focus towards outcomes, okay? Now, that being said, I think the biggest challenge, right, the biggest challenge to scaling the approach is then the reliability of the data, because now you are pinning the entire edifice on this foundation of has the outcome improved, okay? And so, which means that So one of my first studies, and still one of my most highly cited papers, was just on teacher performance pay, right? Where we find that even 3% of pay linked to performance ends up having a huge positive impact. But the reason we've never been able to scale that is because you can't rely on the administrative data, because the administrative data is fudged even without incentives. The moment I put incentives, it's guaranteed to be fudged, okay? Which means the incentives are a non-starter. But which means outcome-based financing is essentially putting an incentive based on outcomes. So the elephant in the room is what is the rate limiting step to scaling is going to be the quality of your data, okay? So which means right now you're able to do this at a scale with independent measurement entities that are serving as a proof of concept, okay? So saying, can we validate the idea? But that model will not give you scale unless you're able to improve administrative data quality at the L0 level, okay? So the L0 is the frontline teacher who's recording the learning of every student. The L1 is the kind of the cluster level supervisor. The L2 is the block level supervisor. The L3 is the district level supervisor. And then ideally you have supervision from outside the department, right? I mean, ideally, because the collector has people from the planning department, like who report to the collector. So one of the things I talk about in the book, and that's why the details really matter, right? The details matter because, see, the good news now is Pratham ASER, after a long time, has been accepted by the government, okay? Which is a huge, huge step, okay? But the truth is we've wasted 15 or 20 years as a country on FLN because Pratham has been saying since 2005 that we have a learning crisis. But even if a senior government official admits in private that the data is correct, in public they have to work with official data, and the official data is all inflated, right? So the elephant in the room is that the official data is inflated, but the independent data is not accepted, okay? So how do you then build systems that will get you truthful data at scale within public systems, okay? So that requires architecting things with a lot of thought, okay? So part of the work we've been doing on state capacity. And then, see, but this is why, like I said, my intellectual journey has been, I did 20 years in education, 15 years on welfare programs, 10 years on health, on child development. And what you see is that our policy conversations always happen at a sectoral level, where we're thinking about sectoral budgets, sectoral programs, sectoral outcomes. But it's these cross-cutting governance issues that are the binding constraint for every development goal, okay? The fact that your average tenure of a frontline officer is 18 months, or the fact that you have 50% vacancies in block education officers' positions, the fact that the money doesn't reach where it has to. So these are cross-cutting governance issues that require dedicated attention to. So I think, so now to answer your second question, which is, so, the outcome measurement is foundational to OBF, and then how do you solve this, right? And how do you solve this is, so the reason we build CGIS is kind of, as it would be ironic to write a book on state capacity and assume it'll happen because the constraint is state capacity, right? Like, so the logic of then building an organization like CGIS, which is the Center for Effective Governance of Indian States, is to kind of provide states kind of the analytical and implementation support to do some of these things about improving, say, admin data quality at scale, okay? Now, but thinking about our own journey, what I would say is at CGIS, we have solved a bunch of technical problems, but we have not yet solved the political problem, okay? So we have solved the technical problems of how do you do nested supervision so that you improve kind of the L0 data quality, which is what you need to scale outcome-based financing, right? So, but politically, it's been hard to accept because nobody wants to be told, like, that their data is problematic, right? So again, why I'm so optimistic about OBF and why I wanted to be here is that the system will respond better to carrots than sticks, okay? So if we are able to kind of think about a next wave of outcome-based financing, where you're actually putting some philanthropic capital, because government may not be able to do this, but providing modest amounts of bonuses, right? I mean, if to teachers or to administrators on improvements in outcomes, but tied to independent verified data, because you can't provide bonuses unless the data is verified, and then that provides effectively an entry point into kind of truthing data at scale, okay? So that's how I see the synergy. Now again, I think I was hearing about a pilot in Rajasthan where, they are in fact making progress looking at just truthing data. There's another NGO that reached out to us recently saying they managed to do this in Maharashtra. So it doesn't have to be top down. The other thing is, what's nice about education as an ecosystem is there are so many partners with so much kind of, deep trust in the context in which they're working, right? So these ideas can be tested and kind of shared and replicated. And part of kind of what I would say to the education ecosystem is that most of your time goes thinking about programmatic interventions, but you will go hit your head against the same brick wall, which is these governance challenges, right? So if you then engage with what some of the governance issues are and kind of circle back about out saying these are the binding constraints. So just like it has taken so much effort to get government finally on board with NEP, NIPUN, all of this on an input-based way, programmatic way, it will take the next wave of push to build this broad understanding about the governance layer that is kind of limiting the translation of kind of the inputs in the schemes into outcomes.
So thank you, Karthik. I think there is so much more to unpack in how you talk about the cross-cutting nature of governance, but I'm also being mindful of time and steering the conversation very specifically to impact measurement from an EdTech lens perspective. Of course, one of the first and much quoted studies of RCT evidence of EdTech came from the work that you did when, as CSF, we had funded EI centers in the community. There's impact evidence for the work EI did in Rajasthan. And of course, now we have impact evidence of Chimple implementation in Bharati schools and the JPAL study of rocket learning. So it's very heartening to see that there are now these building blocks of evidence to go engage with ecosystem stakeholders, donors, but more importantly also the government. Now in the context of there are these green shoots, but we still have a long distance to cover. And now with more confidence and with evidence, we can talk about the efficacy as well as the need for EdTech in classrooms and at home for NIPUN. Where do you see EdTech aligning in service of NIPUN goals, both at a national and specifically state levels?
No, so fantastic question. And again, so first of all, I must again commend the team here, the LiftEd project, for I think picking up two of the most important areas for outcome-based financing, like, because I think EdTech again absolutely squarely fits, fits the criteria. And so let me again give you good news and bad news, right? So the good news is that we have high quality evidence now that kind of personalized EdTech with high quality content can be incredibly effective. Right? Among the most effective interventions we've studied. The bad news is that 99.99% of budgets are still going for hardware, okay? If not 100%, okay? And the evidence is also very clear that hardware by itself has zero impact, okay? So what are we doing here, right? So there's this complete disconnect between kind of what the evidence, so I'm not aware of a single kind of procurement paid for by government, that actually manages to use personalized adaptive learning, so maybe there is, but that's why I'm giving myself wiggle room by saying 0.1%, okay? But I'm not aware of any. So, but now think about the problem from the perspective of the government, right? So you are an officer. You have no idea how to do procurement, okay? Because there is at least like 50 different vendors out there. Everybody says, my app, my shiny app is going to solve your problems, okay? And you don't have the bandwidth to do RCTs. So you can only procure on L1 based on a standardized tender, okay? Which means that given the government procedural limitations, even the best intentioned officer cannot procure this kind of personalized outcomes, right? So it's a wicked problem, right? So where I think, so I think you framed the question more with regard to EdTech for NIPUN, I'll come to that. But in terms of why I think EdTech is especially well suited for an outcome-based financing type of initiative is exactly the same idea where you get risk capital, that says let's leverage government spending because government is going to spend on the hardware anyway. That they will do, okay? And the good news is every politician likes to distribute laptops with their pictures on it. So not only will the budget be allocated, the laptop will actually reach also, okay? The likelihood that it reaches is quite high. Because again, the point is we have to think about the incentives of every actor in the system, okay? Nobody is evil, okay? Everybody is rational and everybody acts according to their incentives, okay? So part of what OBF is doing is aligning incentives, okay, of otherwise disparate characters, okay? So the good news is that the political incentives are aligned to do hardware procurement and distribute computers, okay? So which means that that core cost, that is the bulk of the cost, that is going to be covered by the government, okay? But that box by itself will have zero impact, right? So the opportunity now is kind of for philanthropic capital to come and saying, here is the base of the technology, and now let's write these kind of slightly more sophisticated procurement contracts where you go and saying, we are going to provide the risk capital that's going to do outcome-based financing, and and even there's details that are important to work out. It shouldn't just be based on hurdles and thresholds. I prefer kind of contracts that encourage you to get as good as possible, and pay you more and more on the upside, based on how much you deliver, so that you're really encouraging every provider in the ecosystem to apply their mind. Even with EdTech, I'll say one thing. So Ken Kedinger, who's this famous professor at Carnegie Mellon, who spent 25 years developing models of kind of learning and cognition and has this model called cognitive tutors. So I remember being there with him about 6 years ago at a conference when he said that he believes that it's possible to improve the productivity of education 10x, okay, in terms of how much learning happens in a unit of time, okay? And the 3 levers he talked about one was kind of personalizing the content. No, the first is high quality content, right? The second is personalizing the content. But the third is aligning incentives, okay? Which is whether it's the teachers, whether it's the students. Think about it, right? See, one of the hardest things about education is that the child has to do the work, okay? And the child is functioning at a time when their frontocortical part of the brain is not developed. There is a reason we have a juvenile justice system that holds children under 18 not responsible for their actions, okay? But they have to take the most important actions that are going to set up them for life success at a time when that frontocortical part of the brain is not developed. So, which is why 90% of parenting is just kind of providing the right micro incentives to the kids, right? To do the right things at the right time. So then thinking about the value of technology as a way of kind of through combination of gamification, getting the motivation right. So there is a piece of the content, there's a piece of the personalization, there's a piece of aligning the motivation. And Ken believed that if we put these pieces together, we can do a 10x improvement in productivity, okay? And I feel that what the outcome-based financing movement should be doing is kind of putting just putting the money there and letting the private sector figure it out, okay? And saying that we are going to pay you based on kind of demonstrated gains and then let 1,000 flowers bloom, okay? So that's why I think this model is especially appropriate, and I think the leverage is very, very high. Now, coming back to what you were saying about FLN, about EdTech and NIPUN, see, let me say 2 things, okay? So one is, I think, one neglected part of the education system right now is, I think the biggest dead zone in our school education system is class 6 to 8, okay? And the reason 6 to 8 is the most challenging is we have enough interventions now focusing on FLN. We kind of have an idea, there's national focus, and the content is not that difficult, okay? By the time you get to 6 to 8, that the dispersion in learning levels has expanded massively. The content is now too complicated to do just like volunteer-based programs, okay? And the problem is the worst from 6 to 8 because at 9, you're past your compulsory schooling age, right? So the left tail has already dropped out. But 6 to 8, these kids are captive in school and basically learning next to nothing, okay? And so what we're seeing in our Rajasthan study is that the marginal impact of kind of the personalized EdTech may be highest in 6 to 8. And so that's, I think, something that we should do a lot more work on, okay? With regard to both in fact, Esther Duflo, I think last year, somebody asked her, what do we know about what to do in middle school? And she said, we have no idea, okay? We basically have no idea, okay? Because most of the high quality interventions and evaluations in the past 20 years have happened in school education. There is some stuff in conditional cash transfers, but that has more to do with demand rather than fixing pedagogy within the classroom in 6 to 8, okay? So that's an area where we need a lot more innovation, evaluation, research, and scaling. And so it's not quite NIPUN, but I think it speaks to that. And then, sorry, last part is coming back to Rocket. The Rocket evaluation. Let me just also highlight the centrality of research, okay, and one thing I want to highlight is just because you've done an RCT once is not enough, okay? I cannot emphasize this enough, right? So let's look at EI. Probably one of the best partners, most open to research. I remember Pranav coming and saying how scary it is to kind of, because he's heard me stand up and saying the program has no effect, okay? So it's like how scary it is to open yourself to the possibility that Karthik is going to stand in public and saying the program absolutely failed, okay? Because I've done that, okay? But, so they have been an outstanding partner in terms of being willing to go through that process, okay? But even for EI, what we found is that the Delhi intervention was successful. That was an after-school model. The Rajasthan one was successful. It was very hard, but worked in school. But then during COVID, we tried a version of free tablets loaded with MindSpark given to kids and did an RCT, and we found zero impact, okay? And that's because there was no engagement because you didn't have the adult then spending the time with the kid, and we can track the usage, okay? So just because it worked in one model doesn't mean it's going to work in something else. And same for Rocket, right? Because we did the Rocket RCT, and at the first phase, we found huge effects on a whole bunch of process measures, but no impact on learning. And Rocket was again a high quality partner. Like, I think they've, both Namya and Aziz have spent time in Pratham and Seva. Like, they understand grassroots stuff. They did a fantastic job with regard to getting take up. But moving learning outcomes is difficult, right? I mean, so getting that fact that it didn't work then kind of created the cycle of iteration of saying we need to improve the intensity of the contact. And then it was not just bypassing the worker and going to the parents, but also augmenting capacity of the workers. Okay, so the cycle of iterative learning, I think there are many partners here who I think get really nervous about the idea of an evaluation in RCT because you've dedicated your life to this program and suddenly this one evaluation is going to come and tell you whether you made it or not, okay? And I think that's absolutely the wrong way, okay, to approach the evaluation, and I think it's also the wrong way for the donors to kind of put so much pressure on that one evaluation, okay? It really is an iterative process and you're kind of partnering with orgs for the long run and you want to build a culture of being open to failure and knowing you're failing early as opposed to only wanting to show that you're successful. Okay, so, and as we go in this outcome-based financing journey, I'm a huge fan, but we got to keep certain standards with regard to the evaluation, the rigor, the measurement, and building a collaborative ecosystem where people are not scared to fail and are kind of willing to find out that, wait, I'm doing this very sincerely, but it's not moving the needle, so what more do I need to do? Okay?
Yeah. Thanks, Karthik. Thanks specifically for calling out that one RCT, whether the results are in favor of the program or even if it's not impacting learning outcome, is just one of the milestones in the journey. It's not the end of the journey, and it's more important what those insights then inform the product, the program, and the implementation. Moving to a different aspect, and I do want to save some time for audience questions, is you also talk about, in your book, leveraging innovation coming from the private and the not-for-profit sector. Within EdTech, we have products like Tulna, which we collaborated with IIT Bombay, is now housed under IIT Delhi. Government is using it for procurement. I think there are many innovative areas that do exist, will be early stage, but what would your advice be almost in terms of what should be some of the design principles when we think of collaboration between the public and private when looking for learning gains at scale?
So I think, so again, great question, right? And let me answer with an example that is related but different, okay, from what you asked. I mean, which is, I think, so 2 points, right? One is obviously the private sector, particularly the social impact sector, has an enormous amount of innovation, creativity, and new ideas, and so we should do more of that and kind of figure out what's, what works in scales, but that's well known. I think the part where we're not seeing enough work, but I think CSF has just started, and this is another place where the EdTech can help, is thinking not just about what does the government do as a provider of education, okay, but thinking about the government as a regulator and a policy maker, and how do you make markets work better, okay? And so this goes back to the School Standards Authority, right? Like, I mean, so we have outstanding research evidence with RCTs at a village level showing how providing better information to parents about the quality of every school in a market can have dramatic positive effects on both the private schools and the public schools, okay? Now, the thing is the government in the ecosystem plays 3 very distinct roles. You're a policy maker, you're a regulator, and you're a provider, okay? Now, as a policy maker, the private sector is your ally because you want to deliver as much good for citizens as possible, regardless of who's doing the delivery, okay? As a regulator, the public and private have to be treated equally. As a provider, the private is your competition, okay? Because you're then competing for that same kit. Now, the problem is because 99% of government budgets go to government as provider, the instinct is any education secretary, health secretary thinks of their job as running the public education system, okay? Whereas you can have huge impact by making markets work better. So the reason I mentioned this is just recently I was in a meeting with kind of a senior official in a state, and it just occurred to me that we have the technology now to basically at low cost be able to do census measurement of every kid, like I mean in a block, and kind of then use that to create parent level report cards, school level report cards, and engage the parents and make markets work better. And this is not something anybody is necessarily thinking about innovating because you can't monetize it because this is making a market work, okay? But for the social entrepreneurs, I think some of the highest leverage might come from thinking about interventions to make markets work better, okay? Because that has a force multiplier on the entire ecosystem, which is something that the government per se doesn't think about. Now, that's just an example, but I think so just thinking about areas where there is potential for impact, where there is not, this is entrepreneurship 101, right? There's no design principle here behind saying, hey, look for the white spaces where nobody is, and I'm just giving you an example of that white space, okay? Where I think there is huge white space in kind of thinking about how to make markets work better, while of course there is still a lot of innovation needed in pedagogy and classroom stuff. I think there's enough high quality organizations working on that.
Thank you, Karthik. I think from our conversation, one of the the highest recall value takeaway for me will be what you very simply described as needs to focus on quality of administrative data at level 0. And how do we then build those layers? I think that's the incentive that goes towards how will government look at outcome-based financing. And also the fact that recognizing incentives at every level is something that only a cross-cutting lens of state capacity and governance can solve. Thank you. We do have time for a couple of questions. If we can pass the... We'll just get you a mic there. Abhinav, do you want to get us started? And I think then Amit has a question.
Sure. Thanks for that insightful discussion. Agree with a lot of points that you made. Just a quick question. There are two ways to correct the system. Either to build it up correct from the day 0, which is the example that you gave of China, that the incentives are distributed there at the district level and decentralized decision making. The other way is to correct the system where we are today in India, where the system has not been built correctly with the right incentive. So just wanted to ask you if there are examples where this has been achieved in other economies, or even a smaller example, particularly at a larger scale, where the incentive within the system is misaligned to not correcting it.
No, see, I think if there were some silver bullets, right, like, then we would all be looking at it. I think, see, one thing I will say, of course, the truth is this was probably designed. So one thing which I think is now better known, but I always get slightly irritated when education ministers in India travel to Singapore and Finland, to say, oh, let's see how these great education systems are working, because these are countries with 20 times the GDP per capita and, basically 100% adult literacy, right? So that's not the relevant context. But the country I would like every educationist in India to visit is Vietnam, okay? Because that is the country that has comparable levels of income, and still has managed to deliver incredible outcomes, right? Now, so I think the key to Vietnam, frankly, and this is why sometimes you have to go back and saying how much of this is society versus systems, okay? Which is, at the end of the day, because of a communist legacy, you could argue that what those countries did well was focus more on the left tail of the distribution, right? So we know that the best way to increase life expectancy is to reduce infant mortality. Whereas India, our genetic makeup, for lack of a better word, is a lot more like the US, okay? Which is, we are much more, we fetishize the top much more, right? So we have outstanding world beaters at the top, but what brings down the average is essentially that we just don't focus, right? The bottom half. So I think there's no silver bullet. Now, I think there may be better lessons to learn within India, right? So what does Tamil Nadu do, or Kerala do, or or Maharashtra do? Now again, Tamil Nadu is still not there in learning outcomes, okay? But some aspects of governance, of service delivery, poor programs, and I think what they had was broad-based social reforms, right? Which then created a broader constituency for core government services. So generally you find government working better. But I agree with you fully, right? And that's why one of the things I say in the book is that people sometimes say, oh, where is the role of the citizen and all of this? I'm like, listen, social change is a much longer process, and that's not something we can act on. So in the levers within our control, I agree with you 100%, okay, that we have to work with our path dependence. You can't reinvent our trajectory. We are what we are, okay? I think the reason I give the China example is just to kind of highlight how much of our problems come from over-centralizing and kind of creating a little bit of a discourse towards kind of being more willing and comfortable to decentralize more, right? And I think that is like one cross-cutting piece. And we may have to decentralize in different ways, okay? So for example, where we leapfrog other countries is Vietnam didn't have 50% urban market share of private schools, okay? So given our path dependence, we have to solve for that problem in a different way, okay? So investing in making markets work better with better outcome data is again a way of empowering the parent, actually, right? So it's so Danny Roderick has this very interesting concept of economics. He says, the science of economics is building a set of models. The art of economics is knowing which model applies in which context, okay? So the science of what I'm giving you is a set of principles that says, hey, all the top-down stuff in the world doesn't work work unless because you've activated parents, because see, admin data quality, who's the ultimate stakeholder? It's the parent, right? It's not the administrative, it's not kind of the government, it is the parent. So how do you then activate the parent? So people have tried with school management committees, village education committees, none of it works. And the reason it doesn't work is basically you have no power on the teacher, right? Like, I mean, so we've got RCTs showing that VEC members don't know they're on the VEC, okay? Like, I mean, to naam ke vaste ban ke paper mein it is submitted, right? So, but therefore, given our own path dependence, we have to take these principles and then think about newer solutions that are going to work in our setting, okay? So, yeah. I think I'll stop there, but we can kind of, continue. But I think the outcome-based financing is perhaps, that's why, given our path dependence, that may be a more feasible way of bending the curve, in the way that we want to bend it.
Amit?
Yeah, no, thank you. It's been a fascinating, sorry, over here. It's been a fascinating discussion, and really kind of everything you've said resonates with me. I work for an organization, Bridges, that tries to promote outcomes-based financing in governments, and all the problems you've mentioned have been problems we've come up against, and the governance dynamics are really there. I was wondering if we, as an organization, were going to take 3 actions in working with government to try and increase the take-up of outcomes-based financing. What would those 3 actions be as an outside actor to government?
Yeah, so I think, so one of my own learnings in the past month, right, I think I would say the big aha moment for me, right, was even as CGIS, as we've spent, multiple, years working with state governments, like I said, even we have found it hard with the level of trust we have within government to kind of move from solving technical problems to political problems, right? Because that's above our pay grade, okay? At the end of the day, we can solve technical problems and it's up to the political leadership to decide if they're going to act on it, okay? But the most kind of optimistic lesson for me was this lesson from this nonprofit in Maharashtra, like, that had been just working at the district level, right? And so in some ways, it's almost easier to innovate at a lower level of government. And again, a district in India is bigger than 40% of countries, okay? So a district in India is not a small thing, right? So I think the most important advice, frankly, is to, in a way, what the book is doing is moving the discourse away from our Delhi-centered discourse to emphasizing state-level actions, right? Because 90% of all of these service delivery topics, education, health, district courts, police, land, labor, they're all state government topics, right? But our policy discourse is kind of remarkably Delhi-centric relative to how important the states are, right? So what the book is trying to correct that balance by kind of getting states to act up. But I think we should go one level further, right? And one of the best sayings I've heard about, comes from Ashwin Mahesh, who's the decentralization advocate. And he says the best way to solve India's many problems is to increase the number of problem solvers, okay? And the way you do that then is thinking about district governments as units that actually have a lot of authority, but have almost no, meaningful intellectual or financial support in terms of what could happen at that level, right? So if you are trying to bring in innovations, now the problem today with district innovation is there are tons of collectors who are innovating as we speak, but when they get transferred in 18 months, the next person is not interested because everybody wants to do their own shiny new toy, okay? Now, so where I think the kind of outcome-based capital, can really help move the needle, is to then identify among partners saying what are some of the most promising interventions at a district level that could be activated with a little bit of money and kind of sustained engagement, right, with regard to system strengthening of district administration and governance and even sub-district. And, that might be the sweet spot because at the state level, it's already too high stakes, right? So you want to find the partners who build the trust at a district level and support them with the capital and kind of some of the institutional platforms to then try these innovations. But the key difference is that it'll not just be innovated, it'll be evaluated, it'll be documented, and that is then the key to replication, which doesn't happen when you have like an 18-month pilot that fizzles out after that individual collector has gotten transferred. So you asked for 3, I gave you 1, but hopefully that's actionable.
Oh, thank you, Karthik. It's all conversation. Sorry, I've been told by the organizers to limit the number of questions. With Karthik, the conversation could go on. Always an engaging conversation with Karthik. I think an absolute privilege for all of us that between your very demanding schedule, you were able to prioritize this and join us in person. Thank you so very much.
Thank you.